Modern society filled Cold War intellectuals with anxiety. Its bureaucracy, social fragmentation, homogeneity, and soulless consumerism represented a number of things, including alienation, isolation, and the evaporation of true community. It also meant conformity and the erosion of the nation's frontier spirit and the nation's entrepreneurial character. Without proper care, mass society could lead to mob rule or perhaps a totalitarianism. Cold War social critics and policymakers found the answer to these problems in the systematic and scientific study of individual character. Science provided tools for understanding the kind of person who threatened to make America into the mass society, or into a mass or an authoritarian society. Scientific tools also crystallized the form of exemplary self that would inoculate America against the dangers of mass society. Today I'm going to focus on the construction and use of these scientific tools in order to define the positive self and the negative self. The positive self, the one that would inoculate America against the dangers of mass society and authoritarianism, would be creative and autonomous, which by definition, in terms of the way that the tools were constructed, were interchangeable. So creativity and autonomy, you should, when I use either one of these, you should understand these as being synonymous. Creative people would enable the coherence of America's increasingly complex and diverse culture, so that it can solve the problem perhaps of alienation. At the same time, creative people would also mitigate the conformity that social critics feared was a defining characteristic of mass society or of traditional society. One reason why the creative self was so important was because of the role the psyche had been assigned as a means of understanding or changing society. Starting before World War II and accelerating during and after the war, Americans increasingly looked to psychological rather than structural or institutional ways of understanding social problems, identifying their causes, or managing a solution. The practice of looking at American society through the lens of psychology was pervasive at the time and has been a persistent, though less dominant feature of social criticism and academic inquiry and social criticism ever since. To give a marker for this kind of a transformation I'm talking about, the sociologist Daniel Bell noted that Young and cultural anthropology had supplanted Marx as frameworks for understanding social changes. By now we have a quite familiar story of how the personal became political when we think about the 1960s and 70s as members of the New Left. Second wave feminism and the counterculture emphasized liberating the psyche, producing genuine community through autonomous, creative, and authentic selves. Today, however, I'm focusing on an earlier effort in the 1950s by liberal intellectuals, members of the establishment, who were seeking to politicize personhood as well and to promote autonomous selfhood, also in the service of making a better nation through reforming the self and generating, in some sense, authentic community. Today I will discuss three ways in which intellectuals understood and advocated the connection between the psyche and liberalism. First, I will examine the frameworks and technologies that they developed in order to measure the self. They were concerned by reactionary efforts to maintain the status quo or even revert to the past. Fearing the conformity of mass society, they searched for ways to achieve social and cultural unity, while at the same time respecting individuality and America's plural character. The answer they found to this vision was a particular model of the creative autonomous self. Second, I'll explain how this model of self was used for political ends. Liberal social scientists hoped to mold America into a nation that fit with their vision of a good society. They did so by managing the definitions of creativity and autonomy in such a way that those traits, as defined, would define their political allies. So their allies were creative and autonomous. Conversely, the opposite traits, namely conformity, rigidity, and narrow-mindedness, were so defined as to apply to McCarthyites on the right or communists on the left. In so doing, they marked as irrational the social and political views that they disagreed with, and in so doing, liberal social scientists played an important role in marginalizing non-centrist political ideas as irrational, and thereby helped to generate the apparent consensus of the Cold War era, at least apparent to them. As a consequence, however, social critics of the Cold War era helped to produce the very conformity that they studied and feared. Finally, I focus on the informal and quotidian social life of intellectuals to help explain this irony I just outlined, in order to examine how the forms of self and society that they advocated for America as a whole were grounded in the daily interpersonal interactions that they practiced and valued in their own professional lives. So when we look at this period, we see in works ranging from the, books by William White and David Reisman to mass market magazines, including Reader's Digest, Women's Day, Life, and novels like The Man in the Great Flannel Suit, extensive discussion and fears about growing conformity in the country. So it's not only academics, it's not only middle ground social criticism, it also appears in these mass market journals. And by 1959, a survey of American culture noted that variety and heterogeneity had become one of America's new values. These concerns about individuality at home were energized by the way that social commentators and policymakers looked at international affairs. Domestic conformity suggested to them a lack of distance between the United States and the Soviet Union. According to this view, suburban conformists were rather not very different from the subjects of either the Nazi or the communist states. The reason why they could make this connection was because Americans consistently framed the distinction between capitalism and communism as a conflict between a system that allowed freedom of thought and one that did not. For instance, NSC 68 saw American democracy as constituted by freedom of thought, by reason, tolerance, diversity, and creativity. These views are also found in the work of George Kennan, and also in much more pedestrian literature, such as pamphlets circulated to high school and college administrators by the National Educational Association. One branch of the National Education Association is Educational Policy Committee, which I will refer to as EPC. So this is a group of school superintendents, presidents of Columbia and Harvard, who then were Dwight Eisenhower and James Conant, and representatives of the U.S. Office of Education and Carnegie Fund for Advancement of Teaching. So we look at one of their pamphlets, and they note that democracy can be defined as dedicated to the proposition that intellectual freedom is essential to a worthwhile life and development of mankind. Communism, in contrast, is implacably opposed to this particular freedom. The pamphlet goes on to note that there are many differences between the two societies, but the issue of intellectual liberty appears to be the most basic, clear-cut, difficult, and persistent. So I want to highlight here, intellectual liberty, according to the National Education Association, is the difference between free societies and communism. It's not private property versus state ownership of property. It's not free markets. It's freedom of thought. Academic social scientists play a critical role in this discourse on self and society. Their work gave structure and authority to these ideas, and that circulated among educators, social critics, and policymakers. The most substantive piece of this work, and most famous, is, of course, the Authoritarian Personality, a book published in 1950. Now I'm going to focus on one particular aspect of the Authoritarian Personality, in particular, the ways in which it defined the psychological characteristics of people, both in the way that they related to others and the ways in which those psychological characteristics were mirrored internally. So these people were prejudiced and stereotyped, and so they related to others in that way, but they also had stereotyped thinking internally, which was reflected in a number of ways. So we had a couple of terms of art in which the social scientists used to define this type of thinking. These were stereotyped thinking, rigidity, narrow-mindedness, and one that I'm going to come back to a number of times, intolerance of ambiguity. All of these terms have technical definitions and indicate cognitive deficiencies. Cognitive deficiencies that would appear even independent of other people being in the room, that would apply to memory, thinking, logic, and perception. And that occur in all contexts, including, for instance, inability to do particular kinds of math problems and geometry and so on. Ultimately, the way that the Authoritarian Personality and the associated genre of social science diagnosed the problems with authoritarians was that they lacked a true, authentic self. The authoritarian was missing, the authoritarian was attached to conventional cliches and values, which, according to the Authoritarian Personality, was a crutch that substituted for this absent self.